My name is Roberto Soro. I'm on the faculty at the University of Southern California, and I'm acting as moderator and introducer here. We're going to start with some questions to the individual panelists, and I'll introduce them as we're going along. Our intent here is to build off the last discussion, which gave us a great example of a whole community response to the specifics of the immediate situation and of building capacity in the long term to provide services to immigrants and develop capacity in this sector. We want to try and expand that conversation both geographically and conceptually here. We have panelists from 5 different places, and one of the interesting factors in all of this is the extent to which local conditions really help determine the way these responses develop, and what kind of a whole of community response you get depends very much on the characteristics of the place. We're going to talk again about responses to developments with this administration, but try and expand the conversation to talk about how these kinds of developments, the developments of these kind of capacities are scalable and spreadable, and how they develop. And I'm going to try and take the conversation beyond immigrants and immigrant services themselves to talk a little bit about how these efforts bring together players from different sectors of civil society and create an altogether different kind of capacity, a capacity for interaction, for coordinated work, for connections between different types of civic actors, whether they be funders, faith organizations, professional organizations, community organizations, to work together and actually build a kind of capacity for communities that goes beyond immigrants. And it gives us a way of thinking about immigrant rights as something that contributes to the development of an entire community, that improving the capacity to provide legal services to immigrants in very specific situations can in fact be a way of building a better democratic society that has much broader implications than simply how many cases you handle. You're actually building relationships, a kind of political discourse, a kind of moral normative discourse, which has an impact on an entire community. We'll start with the immediate issues and some of the how organizations have pivoted in the immediate circumstances. And I want to start with Jessica Schulroff-Schneider from Americans for Immigrant Justice in Miami, which is an organization that might be older than many of the others here. It has its roots going back certainly several decades, and is one that is an organization that's grounded in legal services but operates in a variety of realms, including public advocacy and public education, and it has a wide range of allies. I'm curious, Jessica, to hear you talk a bit about how the Americans for Immigrant Justice brought along its various allies and the various partners that it has as it pivoted into new kinds of activities in 2017, and how that process developed.
Thanks so much. It's on, right? Yes?
A little closer.
We have to push the little, do you have a green light?
Is this thing on, right?
Yeah.
All right, great. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things, of course, is we had a lot of emergency strategic planning meetings. I'm sure as many of you had. Miami is kind of of a little bit of a strange animal in the sense that there's a lot of money in Miami. Anybody that's seen Will Smith videos knows that there are rich people that reside there, but not a whole lot of interest to get involved or to give money to immigrants' rights, right? Or immigrant advocacy issues. At least that's how it was in the past. And I would say one of the, I guess, positive things or silver linings that happen with the new administration is that a lot of people kind of woke up, right? Particularly folks that were part of the Cuban community, many of them who came as refugees. And you have a very unique situation in Miami because Miami is a community where you have a large foreign-born population, a very big Cuban community there. But Cubans, as many of you may or may not know, benefit under the Cuban Adjustment Act, and many came as refugees or just by virtue of stepping foot on U.S. soil had access to a whole host of immigration benefits. So their immigration narrative, their immigration story, their immigration experience varies so widely from what so many of us all over the country and immigrant communities all over the country, have experienced in the past. And so I think that there's a little bit of a disconnect there, or there has been historically. But what we saw is that, our board got together, lots of strategic planning meetings, and really reached back out to funders that had been, or folks that had been kind of lukewarm in the past about wanting to fund us, and happy to say we're really, of course, horrified basically by what was going on with the narrative regarding immigration, due to the Trump administration, and so have been able to secure other funds to really be able to pivot, right? Because we were not out in the community in the same way, because the folks that were being apprehended and detained were not the community members in the same way that's happening right now, right? And so that's definitely one of the great things that I would say has happened, and also current funders also reaching out to us saying, what's happening, do you need to pivot, and being able to work with our current funders to pivot from the kind of traditional work that we were doing more, to engaging in more advocacy, engaging in more education, and have, so far conducted over, 30 Know Your Rights presentations and outreach events into the community, have really tried to re-engage with our community partners to make sure that we're getting out into the community, that we're educating the community, because all of those things are so important. Due to the commitment of new and current funders, we're actually hiring a director of advocacy and a director of litigation, because we feel that these areas are just so crucial to what's coming, right? That we're litigating things, that we're advocating, and not just doing kind of the on-the-ground direct representation work, although that is certainly crucial and certainly informs both our litigation and advocacy. And one of the things that we also did was to create a detention hotline, which allow community members in South Florida to call and to report when one of their loved ones or family members is detained, so that we can go out and we can try and do intakes and provide and see really who's being picked up in the community. Not only can we provide legal assistance to them, but to really start to track trends to see what is it that's happening on the ground, because that is something that is constantly changing. And I think one of the things that's so difficult about pivoting with this work is that it's always shifting, right? And so making sure that we're always, the directors of our programs are always meeting, always trying to, kind of trade war stories about, well, what's happening here, what's happening on the ground there. Okay, staff needs to respond to this appropriately. Staff needs to take this into consideration, and all those, sorts of things. So it's, pivoting from, the larger aspect of the funders and those kinds of things, but also pivoting with our on-the-ground, even just legal strategy, the way that we're, approaching our cases. And so And one of the other things that we did that really actually grew out of the airport response, you know, like the last panel had mentioned, previously in South Florida, you know, is a tough community to get a lot of pro bono attorneys. Nobody wanted to represent these kinds of cases. It was a tough sell, and I think a lot of us really struggled in comparison to other larger metropolitan areas where you had the private bar that, you know, would take a lot of these kinds of cases and had partnerships with existing nonprofit organizations. And we really saw that there was a huge outcry from the private bar that signed up for, you know, kind of the rapid response to go on the ground in the airport. And so we created kind of like a South Florida, you know, response team in order to harness that energy that was there for the airport response, which thankfully was not needed for too long of a period of time. And due to the immigrant population in South Florida, you know, we didn't have kind of the massive folks that were being stopped in the same way as in other large metropolitan areas. And how do we engage those folks to come along the ride with us, right, onto helping us as we are engaging in response to raids or to other kinds of issues. So creating a listserv, we've done some, you know, trainings and CLEs and trying to engage, you know. And I think one of the challenges that I'll throw out there that we have is, you know, how do we organize and how do we support all these volunteers and folks that are now coming out of the woodwork and that now want to help us, right? And I think that that's an amazing thing, but our capacity is so limited, and all of the nonprofit organizations that work and collaborate alongside with us also have limited capacity. And so how do we engage appropriately and collaborate to really harness that new energy that's there? And I think that's something that we're working with and that we're kind of figuring out right now locally in the South Florida area.
Well, thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Reverend Edwin Robinson, the Managing Director of Faith in Texas, to approach the same question really from a different point of view. A coalition that isn't grounded necessarily in immigrant rights or the immigrant communities, but has a much broader mission and involves a broader grouping of interests, operating in what has become a contentious environment here in Texas on this issue. Tell us something about how coalition building has developed in this environment and in your particular area.
Sure. I'm really grateful to be here today with all of you, mostly attorneys, and some friendly faces I see out here. What's up, Bill? But before I do that, actually, I believe, because I'm an organizer, right, and we're in a really stressful time and we keep getting hit and knocked down, I also believe in celebrating. And so I want to celebrate that Dallas City Council has joined, is going to join the lawsuit against Texas, against SB 4. And, but I want to celebrate that that's not a thing that just sort of happened out of the air, but there are, the work of building coalition is what pushed that forward. And so I want to celebrate three particular people who are in the audience today, and that is Juliana of the North Texas Immigration and Education Table. Please stand. Douglas, oh, she stepped out. Douglas from Proyecto Immigrante, who is in the back there. Please stand up, Douglas. Stand up, let them see you. And the person who I think is the baddest, best organizer in the state of Texas and maybe the country, Maria Robles, who is sitting right here. Stand up, Maria. Maria, stand up. These are people who have been working on immigrant rights for years and for some time. Before even I got into the work of doing what I know as professional organizing. They've been doing this for some time, and so I wanted to take the time to celebrate them. In the context of building coalition in the broader space, Faith in Texas, we work through faith communities for two reasons. One, basic issue of demographic and population, right? There are in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, there are 5,000 plus just Christian faith communities, which is a whole lot of power and a whole lot of people. And then the reality is in the South, people just go to church. They do anything in there, but they go to church, right? And that's for the Christian faith community. And then when we add in our sisters and brothers who are in the Jewish faith community and the Islamic community, we begin to grow that number to something very close to 10,000 faith communities, which is a lot of power, and a lot of power that then gets left on the table. So that's sort of just maybe the instrumental reason. But I think the more particular reason is something that I think about a quote of MLK, of Dr. King, and we all know who he is. But he was giving a speech in 1966 on the campus of SMU. And one of the things that he was responding to is this reality that legislation, right? If we're really going to move things, then we need to have heart change. And he said, he's a preacher, right? And so he believes that on Sundays, he does that every Sunday. He's trying to change the heart and move the hearts of people. But he also said, it may be true that legislation cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that legislation can't make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me, and I think that's good too. The reality of building coalition across these broader spaces, especially using the faith community, is that you actually don't have to choose one or the other. You actually don't have to choose heart change or heart restraint. You actually get to do both. And so when we're able to organize in faith communities in these multiple spaces, and we're able to get clergy to begin to preach and teach, whether it's on Friday night in the masjid, on Saturday in the temple, or on Sunday morning in their congregation, about the rights of the right to human dignity, for most faith communities, the imago Dei, which means being created in the image of God and what that actually means. And then we get those same clergy to not just show up by themselves, but to bring their congregations to bear witness in City Hall, like happened yesterday in Dallas, and in this Texas State Legislature that has happened this year. When we do those things together, not only have we created heart change, restrained the heart, created heart change, but we've also restrained the heartless, and we've done them both at the same time. And so being able to build these broader coalitions then allows me to get my white sisters and brothers, my black sisters and brothers, my Latino sisters and brothers, my South Asian sisters and brothers, not focused on stopping SB4 or keeping it from happening, but it actually gets them focused on creating human dignity. And so then when someone in our community, right, because we've built this, when someone in our community is affected, we're all affected, right? We say that. It's great to say, but it's harder to actually create. And you create that not by having people attack an issue, SB4. Not to say that SB4 doesn't need to be attacked. The back of that building needs to be broken because it is killing our people. But what we're actually able to do then is we respond more to pain than we do to joy. It's really weird how we do that. But we do, but it's not about our response to pain. It's not about necessarily the fact that we respond to pain, but it's how, right? And how we respond to pain. If we respond to pain with a hopeful message, right, that I'm going to move forward in spite of my pain, what happens is when our community is hit with pain, then we move forward together in a hopeful way to begin to break the back of that thing that keeps causing us pain. But it takes time to do that. It takes energy, it takes the will, and it takes people crossing barrier. So being able to build coalition across sort of our faith spaces, which then allows us to build coalition across racial space, which then allows us to build coalition across economic space. So when we're doing a training on intro to faith-rooted organizing and an executive order comes down at the same time, creating a travel ban, and people leave the training and go directly to the airport, and we didn't even know they were there until I was sitting on my couch seeing those same leaders and clergy who were in the training on the news, who are black, who are white, who are Muslim, who are Christian, who are Jewish, who are South Asian, and then they call me and say, Edwin, what are we going to do from the airport? That's how we actually begin to move things in a major way They call their legislators, they vote, and we're able to change this country.
Excellent. Thank you. Sarah Lonius is the co-founder and anti-deportation team leader of Keep Tucson Together, a relatively new organization that's closely focused on legal services. I'd like to turn to you to address the same question of expanding the base of support in current context and how you've gone about it.
Sure. Well, thanks. It's nice to be here. I think, because we are here in Texas in this political moment, it's important to say that Keep Tucson Together really was born out of massive mobilizations that were happening around SB 1070 back in 2010. We're part of No More Deaths, so we're not new necessarily, but Keep Tucson Together itself is, and it really came out of collaborative organizing work that was happening in Tucson that was led mainly by migrant-led grassroots organizations and Chicano barrio-based organizations. And in that work, one of the things that we realized, first of all, was that it had to be from the grassroots, that our more established NGOs were not really mobilizing. They weren't turning up, they weren't listening, and they weren't acting. And what we also knew too was that as we were going to our community broadly and saying, what stand will you take on this? You can't sit idly by, you must take a stand, and we will know what your stand is and who are you going to side with. And as we were talking to undocumented families and saying, no, really, you don't have to leave. We're gonna build the power to fight and protect each other. When we were saying that, what we also realized was that we didn't have the capacity to actually step up and help people fight removal proceedings if they were put into proceedings. That was a real problem. And so that's why Keep Tucson Together exists. So in this current moment, what we have been seeing is a testing of a lot of the successes that those efforts, those super grassroots efforts that came out of 2010 and the response to SB 1070, we got a lot of wins in terms of polymigra activity in our area. And so the fear factor when the executive orders were coming down, first when people learned who won, right? And then the executive orders and all of that, what I kept hearing in our community was, well, we've been through this before. They couldn't break us last time, and they're not gonna break us now. And that was the response. Now, the fear factor in Tucson, sometimes I feel like we're on the edge of the world, But the fear factor there was still off the hook, like I know all of you experienced as well. And we had to respond to that. We had to respond to that fear, take it seriously. It is serious. And so we did launch a very broad campaign called the People's Power Campaign. We didn't realize that the ACLU would turn around and do the same later on. But there's elements, I saw some of you picking up pieces of this out on the table there. So these are two of the elements of that warrant signs and what we call a paquete de poder, encouraging people to carry 2 years worth of documentation on them. And also it's an experiment, but we include a notarized form demanding a hearing in front of an immigration judge as well. So if you pick this up and play with it, let us know if you get to test it. Thankfully, we haven't had to test it yet, so I want to know though. And then other stuff too, like expanding G28s, getting them out to everyone, reinvigorating hotline responses, having everyone that we work with broadly in the community carry a letter addressed to law enforcement so that if they're stopped, or more frequently now what we see is Border Patrol themselves stopping people under traffic violation purposes, supposedly, that there's a letter that they present to that law enforcement saying, I have an attorney, it's from their attorney, this person is represented by me. They have been informed not to answer any questions except to provide their name. If you have questions, please contact me. We've not had to test that yet either. This is really good, and that's a response to the successes that came out of the organizing work that happened in 2010. But we can't sit idly by and assume that everything is going to be hunky-dory, right? So we are continuing to mobilize with all of our partners from 2010, and thankfully now, one of the things, so when we talk about kind of these new sectors coming forward, one of the things that we've been seeing is that in the past, we were way too risque for most attorneys to want to play with us. You know, we were considered too edgy, you know, anyway. That's no longer the case. We have private attorneys that are coming forward out of the woodwork saying, we want to work with you. Put us to work. And believe me, we are happy to oblige. In fact, this Saturday, we have a big training happening at the U of A Law School with Nina Rabin, who works there, and our supervising attorney, Margot Cowan, who will be training all of these would-be volunteer attorneys so that we can actually get them plugged in and build some of the capacity that we really have needed for many, many years. But instead, we've had this super grassroots neighbors trying to demystify the law for folks and help, you know, throwing any wrenches we can at the mix to stop deportations and to keep people with their families. Because, again, we know that if our communities are not intact, we can't build power, right? And so that's been the big change for us, is that we're seeing these more established NGOs, private attorneys and others stepping forward and wanting to be part of it, and that's really great. And I hope that in a couple years I can come back and tell you how much of a success that's been. Thanks.
Thank you. Kathy Doan, Executive Director of the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition, the capital in question. In this case, is the nation's capital.
It is the nation's capital.
In pursuing the highly risque business of pursuing immigrants' rights and legal representation, your organization has built significant alliances with the legal community in your area. And I want to engage you in a conversation about that and how you've developed, I mean, clearly it's one of the priorities in these kinds of activities in the moment is engaging the pro bono bar. We've already heard that here in the Houston example and some of the others. And so perhaps you could talk about how that developed and how also this question of how it may have changed after the election.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, first a little bit of background on CARE Coalition, and then I will be happy to address the question. The mission of the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition is to ensure justice for immigrant men, women, and children threatened with detention and deportation. So our largest program are our legal services programs, which are focused exclusively on detained immigrants. We have 5 detention centers in Maryland and Virginia that house right now about 1,000 immigrants on any day. So we go in, do know your rights, individual consultations, and then pro bono placement of cases with these facilities. We also work with unaccompanied immigrant children. There are now 5 facilities, again in in Maryland and Virginia, that house unaccompanied immigrant children. So we go in and provide a similar menu of legal services. We also work under our Virginia Justice program with public defenders and criminal defense attorneys in Virginia, because another entry point into the detention and removal system has been people who have not been appropriately represented in the criminal context by lawyers who do not understand the intersection between criminal law and immigration law. And so this is an effort to try to get them from even being put in the pipeline in the first place by doing education and training on the criminal side. We also, through our Community Conversations program, do Know Your Rights presentations, and we have been increasingly linking up with schools. A lot of calls from teachers, from churches, from other community members that we would not necessarily have been working with before, but are desperate for basic Know Your Rights information. And so those are our main program areas, and in 2016 we served over 4,000 immigrant men, women, and children with a staff of 23. The way we are able to do that is our partnerships with law firms. DC, we are very fortunate. There is a very strong pro bono culture in DC, which I appreciate isn't in every part of the country, but it has really inured to our benefit. So we do have lawyers from big law firms that represent detained individuals who are willing to travel 3 hours to a detention center. And so part of it, I guess it's sort of framing expectations. We do, so sort of over the years, sort of the expectation is you will go 3 hours to a detention center, right? I mean, it's not, so it's kind of part of what we do, and this is how you help, and this is how you help folks. And so we also use law firms not just for direct representation, and this is another point that I want to make, that again, in terms of sort of thinking more broadly around particularly impact litigation, because quite honestly, on the national stage, I don't think we can expect any significant movement toward any type of comprehensive immigration reform or reform of the detention removal system. I think there's a lot of work on the local level that can be done, but in terms of moving forward, I think litigation, and particularly impact litigation, is an important space. And so one of the ways that we're engaging attorneys is through something called our Crim in Pro Bono project, and that is attorneys who are actually taking cases up to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and challenging the inclusion of certain criminal convictions as being things that will lead to detention or deportation. And we have been successful in taking a number of categories of crimes out of that rubric, and so that means people won't get detained in the first place. And one of the things, firms have helped us with amicus briefs, with trainings. So one of the ways in which we have been able to deepen our connections with law firms is offering them a menu of options in addition to just direct representation. In any type of coalition building effort, it's important to understand what each partner both can give as well as gain, what their concerns are. And so for a lot of firms, they, again, this may be sort of unique to DC. I don't think it is necessarily, because DC firms have offices in a lot of other parts of the country. So within a lot of firms, there's like a pro bono requirement that you have to meet. And so not everybody's a litigator. There are attorneys who are afraid to go to court. It's sort of amazing. But maybe they'll help you with an appeal, or maybe they will come on a jail visit with you. And so to the extent those of you, in the audience are thinking about ways to engage law firms, have a conversation with the head of the pro bono committee, with the pro bono partner, how can I help you meet your numbers, or how can I help you meet your goals? And it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, so think about other opportunities beyond just direct representation of a case that you can engage, say, non-litigators, right, that helps move your work forward. One of the things that Carol Coalition also is doing is convening something called DMV. It's not the Department of Motor Vehicles, it's DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Immigration Alliance is an alliance of law firms, law schools, public defenders' offices, legal service organizations that has come together in the wake of the election, really started out with no more than an idea of how can we weave a tighter safety net. And so we just started talking, and a couple of things that come out of that are basically sort of a couple of buckets of work. One is finding out, helping people access legal counsel when they really can't afford an attorney, right? And so how can we do this for people who might have a form of relief that they're eligible for but don't know it? So let's see if we can identify some people who they can apply for something now and take them out of the pipeline. So one of the things we've been doing are large-scale consultations, 100, 150 people at a time. We partner with churches, and we partner with a local social service provider, and then we partner with law firms. So we actually have a law firm partner out of New York that coordinates through something. There's an association of pro bono counsel that's nationwide. So he reaches out from New York to attorneys in the DMV to recruit them for these consultations. We've had 40 or 50 non-immigration attorneys from these big firms, don't know a thing about immigration, but we have an intake that's essentially, I like to say, idiot-proofed. If you answer the questions, they're very detailed. And then we have a panel of immigration experts. So again, it's a huge resource issue in the immigrant service provider community, but if you can get 5 or 6 immigration experts, spend 4 or 5 hours on a Saturday, who, you know, you can get 100 people through. And then so you do a non-immigration attorney does the initial consult, gets reviewed, and then they go back and they talk to the person. We also pair that with a Know Your Rights presentation. So even if people walk away saying, look, if you're detained, maybe cancellation of removal, no guarantees, but there's nothing you can do right now, but at least they've gotten a Know Your Rights presentation to, at a minimum, educate them to the fact they do not have to open that door. Because one of the things that anybody working in this space knows is that immigrants 95% of the time give the information to ICE that they need to detain them. You're asked where you're born. As soon as you say it's somewhere other than the US, boom, that's enough to detain you, and we'll figure it out later. So to the extent that you can at least keep the door shut, then maybe, you know, immigration counts on you opening that door. So if you're keeping it shut, then maybe they'll actually go away. So again, leaving people with something. A couple of the other buckets that the DMV Immigration Alliance are working on is tracking ICE enforcement. The DMV, we do have some challenges because a lot of our stakeholders move between DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And so what's happening in you know, Arlington is going to impact someone who may be driving there from Maryland, even though they live in Maryland, right? And so we're developing a spreadsheet that's trying to track what are the enforcement patterns. I mean, there are police agencies that don't have a 287G agreement, but in this ambiance have been empowered to ask people their immigration status. And then immigration gets called and boom, yeah, there's no 287G, but they're just as detained as if they were. But you may have some Fourth Amendment violations there. So one of the things we've done is partner with the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs. And I was actually going to give a shout out to one of the partnerships we should be talking about is with civil rights organizations. So that if you are, you know, again, maybe this is principally for folks in the detention space, but to the extent you're hearing about people being detained in ways that do not appear lawful, but you do not have the bandwidth, you know, if you're partnering with your local ACLU, we are also working with the Maryland, the Virginia ACLU, you can turn that over to them. Again, this sort of idea of everybody in your collaboration is working to their highest and best use. You don't have to become an expert in civil rights. Go find somebody who is. What you can do is you are interacting with the community whose rights are being violated. So again, just some ideas about kind of expanding that partnership. And the other thing that DMV Immigration Alliance is trying to do is sort of what you've heard before about information sharing. And it doesn't have to be complicated. A listserv and like a calendar set up through a Google Doc. So you know what training opportunities, where Know Your Rights presentations are, so you're not duplicating efforts. I think that's also important. And then one of the things that we're working on right now is a volunteer referral list. And it's been mentioned a number of times, people have come out of the woodwork wanting to volunteer, which is great, but if you're a social service provider and you have no full-time volunteer coordinator, it's like you don't often know what to do with these people, and in fact, they're sort of taking away from the core of your work. But we want to get them engaged. We want them to see, quite honestly, how bad it is, really. You know, that's one really helpful thing that can come out of getting more people engaged. So a volunteer referral list, so there are about 20 or so organizations now involved in the DMV Immigration Alliance. What are your volunteer opportunities? So if they come and they call Care Coalition and sorry, we can't really use them, but we don't want to lose them, go over here. So they're not calling, kind of like on the client side when they're calling 5 different organizations and everybody's saying we can't help you. On the volunteer side, I think that's true as well, because I think it really does behoove us to think about how we capture, and not just for a one-off, but how we engage people who have not been in this space before, who want to come forward as volunteers. It does take a certain amount of time and energy, but it is going to be, I think, helpful in the long run. So those are just a few ideas.
Excellent, thank you. And now on to Apolonio Morales, the political director of the Coalition for humane immigrant rights in Los Angeles. So CHRLA, if you don't know it, is a big, well-established organization that's been a very prominent player in Los Angeles for many years, active on many fronts, operating in what I think we could characterize as a supportive environment, certainly compared to other parts of the country in terms of immigrant rights. So let's concentrate on one of your particular areas of interest, which is public policy advocacy, and especially post-election initiatives at the state and local level. How CHRLA has used its alliances in coalitions on public policies in ways that is reflected back on service delivery and some of the other activities you have in the community.
Well, thank you, Roberto. I apologize, I'm a little jet lagged and I quit coffee, so it's really hard for me right now. But having said that, I'm going to blow your mind right now. So we have, in California, we have two words that we put together, and it's progressive and values. And it may be coming as a shock that progressives have values, but we apply them across the board. So under this idea and this notion that we are all Californians. And with that means being more inclusive of immigrants, being more inclusive of the Muslim community, being more inclusive of the LGBT community, faith community. Everyone has a place in California. And with that idea is this whole community response that we're talking about is something that actually began, that we call a resistance, but began, at least for the immigrant rights movement, post Proposition 187 in California. There wasn't much political power, there wasn't much of an electorate, and all these anti-immigrant bills were passing at the state level that were starting to impact people's lives. So the response to that over the course of many years of civic engagement, the citizenship, folks felt compelled to become citizens, the voter registration, and the getting out to vote. The fact that you had now elected officials who were sons and daughters of undocumented immigrants or had family that was undocumented, the immigration experience was very close to them. Now, having that kind of fertile soil to be able to move a lot of these progressive types of policies at the state level is what has resulted in what we have now, really moving the needle and trying to, at least from a California perspective, deal with the issue of immigration in a proactive way and instead of a punitive kind of way. So what we're faced right now is another Prop 187 moment, but with completely different circumstances at the state level. So we feel that we've made some strides over the course of many years, and we really lift up the idea that an attack on one community is an attack on all communities. So we're starting to build those alliances and really stretching beyond our traditional allies. We're very strong with labor, community organizations, but really reaching out to other folks that we don't directly work with in a way that we have not before. So what are we doing? And I wanted to mention the LA Justice Fund just a little bit, because Kathy mentioned it when she was asking her question, and I thought, oh, I don't have to say very much about this at all. But that's not the case, really. So the LA Justice Fund is it's a model of representation, and I'm going to tie into what's happening at the state level with that as well. So foundations and some the county and the city of Los Angeles have created this idea of a fund, and I call it an idea because it has not been finalized and approved yet. $5 million would be coming in from foundations, and another $5 million would be coming in from the combination of the city and the county of Los Angeles. Those $10 million would then be used for attorneys or immigration attorneys to be able to represent folks in court. So that, again, we've heard, once you have representation, then your chances of, figuring something out for yourself increase dramatically. So this is a great idea that's modeled after what's happening in New York around this notion of universal representation, because what we've seen is this idea of the criminal and the immigration kind of issues combined together. But what's missing is that representation, right? If I'm a U.S. citizen, I commit a crime, I have access to somebody that can represent me. But if I'm not, if I'm undocumented, then I don't. But we blur the line. So this is kind of the imbalance that exists in our system right now. Having said that, the effort to really define who is included and who is not included in the LA Justice Fund is a fight we're having, right? So does everybody deserve representation, or just a select few deserve that representation? So from Chairless perspective, we want to be, everybody should deserve some representation, because just because you're charged with something doesn't actually mean you did it. And some of the problems that we have seen in the past is, especially with the deportations happening in the Los Angeles County area and Southern California and California in general, is that yes, there is less folks that are getting picked up that don't have any prior interaction with ICE or criminal convictions, but the folks that are getting picked up have on an average been living here for 20 years. So they may have done something when they were younger. They changed their life completely, and now they're facing deportation 20 years later. So this is the type of circumstance that we're running up against, and we're trying to convince our progressive elected officials that this is something that, this notion needs to be expanded. So that's kind of the rub right there. How does it relate to the state? Well, the state has something that we've been trying to really advocate for and push for with many allies, and that's SB 54. That's a Senate Bill 54, the California Values Act. Senator De Leon has introduced it, and what that is, essentially no resources from the state will be put into a mass deportation machine. So, sharing of information, those types of handing people over to ICE easily. There's certain protocols that are going to be established, and the way we look at it is really, we're just upholding how the Constitution is supposed to work. All right, this is not a special program for undocumented community. This is really upholding what already exists in terms of protections and in terms of the law. So I think that's one thing to really, lift up when folks are having kind of issues with these type of progressive policies. Is like, we don't have that. We don't have guaranteed protections under the law. So sometimes the states have to step in and make sure that our communities are insured, at least that, at the end of the day. So what's at stake with SB 54 is this notion of a sanctuary state. So it would really set us apart with the federal government in terms of what they're trying to do with the executive orders and what Senator Jeff Sessions is trying to do. And just one thing to remember is, regardless of what happens with this, the current president, the wheels have been set in motion for a mass deportation machine. So the executive orders are the blueprint, but the budget is where the money is going to come from to actually implement, to hire more ICE agents in the interior. So regardless of what happens to the leadership at this moment in time, if the money goes in, right, the system begins. So what will be the response if that happens? How do we hold our elected officials, both Republicans and Democrats, accountable right now in terms of the budget to make sure that that doesn't happen? So those are the things that we're wrestling with at the state level. We do have the Due Process for All. It's a Senate Bill 6, sponsored by Senator Wessel, which is now rolled into, because this idea of universal representation, right, now is being rolled into the budget for California. So what does that mean? In California, we have something called One California, and One California is a fund that's kind of developed to be able to give community organizations the ability to provide legal services at low cost for folks that are aspiring to become citizens, for folks that are DACA recipients, or folks that want to have intake and figure out whether they qualify for something or not. So those U-Visa cases, those family petitions. So this fund began at around, I think it's like $15 million, and then last year it went up to about $30 million, and now this year they're looking really investing in it up to $45 million. But within that funding, it's going to be expanded to be inclusive of those community organizations or the folks on the ground that can provide attorneys, representation for these deportation defense types of cases. So California is investing in that, not just through symbolic gesture, but also through protections, lifting up those constitutional protections, but also having folks have representation at the end of the day. So what that translates into is we might not be able to stop the mass deportation system completely, but we can slow it down. Because slowing it down means the difference between a young girl or boy having their mom or dad be able to come home. At the end of the day, is we're looking at it from, this is going to be impacting families in a very negative light. It's going to impact our local economy. We have 900,000 undocumented immigrants in LA County alone. So if you start mass deporting people, that has a huge drain on our economy, a huge impact on the workforce, a huge impact on the school districts. What happens when the kids are gone because they went with their parents? who's going to teach the class, who's going to pay the teachers, all these things come into effect. So it's a very, goes down very quickly, right? Everything starts to devolve in that sense. So as this work continues, we also want to make sure that folks are protected when they get that type of legal representation or that legal advice. So we've been sponsoring, along with Garesen, a Central American organization, a notario bill. And AB 638, what it says is, you know, if you're an individual who is engaging in providing immigration consultant services, you actually have to be a practicing attorney or you have to be accredited. So what we find is a lot of folks come to our doors and they've been paying somebody thousands of dollars for a long time, and they now are finding themselves in deportation proceedings. So then we try to connect them with an attorney that can help them out. So, but by that point, it's already too late. So we have, you throw a rock in LA, you're gonna hit a notario. So in order to prevent that, in order to raise the bar in representation and then have an impact on people getting, you know, ripped off, number one, people being impacted, you know, negatively. There's some horrible stories, right? You know, we forgot to add your youngest kid on the application. You know, now he or she is undocumented, but everybody else is a citizen. So very simple mistakes that have been done that folks have to then figure out how to rectify. And in this current environment, it's not helpful to keep putting more people into that situation. So those are some of the, at least the state policies that we've been working on, and at the local level as well. And also just really reiterating the fact that we need to engage our local ICE representatives, our regional directors, to be able to say, you know, if there is no priority, what are your protocols? And this is something that we did in the past with this called the Family Unity Commission, and working with faith communities, coming together, community groups, and the people that are impacted, bringing our members of Congress, and bringing ICE to the table. So explain to us what the process is. Let's figure it out. Can we create some kind of relationship? Because it may be a long time before there's any dramatic changes on immigration that are in favor of immigrants at this moment in time. So,
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all. We have some time to engage all of you in questions and conversation. So please come forward to the microphones if you've got a question. In the meantime, let me forewarn the panel that before we close, I'm going to ask you each to offer a bit of a prompt for the breakout sessions that are going to come after lunch. And the prompt relates to, if you take the idea that has come up in several of these the comments here, that crises like SB 1070 or Prop 187 become moments where the immigrant-serving sector grows, develops, takes on new directions, builds alliances. If we want to be optimistic or cynical, depending on your point of view, about the current crisis and see it as an opportunity, what are the outcomes we can aspire to out of this moment? And outcomes beyond simply increasing the number of immigrants who have legal representation or simply reducing deportation. If we want to change the political culture around immigrants, what can we hope for out of this crisis? And I think that's something that we can pass along into the breakout sessions that go beyond. What are the outcomes we can measure, that we can see, that we can aspire to? Now, questions. I see some people already here.
I have a couple of very simple questions. The first one to Reverend Robinson. I come from a very conservative community. How do we respond to the church's leadership saying, but these guys have broken the law? You know, they've already broken the law, so why should we help them?
That's a wonderful question, and so I think that, thank you so much for that. I think the assumption sometimes is that the only people doing this work are the political liberal or the political progressive. What I love about the work that we do is that we are sincerely nonpartisan, and it is about creating a message that rises above the political conversation. To the point that you're making, this is not about. This is actually not about trying to get people to, from the outset, sympathize with someone else's plight. I know that sounds weird, but the actual reality is the goal is actually to get people to come to terms with their own pain. And I don't start conversations with congregations about, aren't you mad about SB4 and immigration? The conversation starts with, what is the pain that's actually going on in your own congregation? And so no matter where you sit in the sphere, there's something happening, right? Whether you are the family who has the family member that you don't talk about who is strung out on meth, or whether you are the person who took out a payday loan, right, and it destroyed your family. Whatever, there's some pain, right, that is deeply in your community. And so the goal then is to help that faith community actually deal with their own pain, because once people connect to their own pain, then they're able to empathize with the pain of others. And so a lot of times, so I always say there's a difference between activism and organizing. Now, not that one is bad and one is good, because I'm an activist at heart and an organizer by trade. But activism is saying, this is my thing that I'm mad about, and you come follow me. And then when you don't, why don't you? Right? Not necessarily a bad thing, because people need to do that. Organizing then, though, says, this is the thing that I'm concerned about. What is the thing that keeps you up at night? What's the thing that you're concerned about? And then begin to build that, and then use that pain to connect to the pain of others, right? Jesus says, the Bible says, we have not a high priest, talking about Jesus, that is not touched with the infirmities of others. And so actually be able to make that connection.
Okay, thank you. And Sarah, you mentioned a letter that people would get from their attorney. The people we work with don't have the finances to hire an attorney. Could we get, is there a possibility of one that doesn't require a retainer that would do it for a large group of people?
So, not knowing your community, I can't answer that.
I know we don't have it in our community, but
Yeah, I think that these are the kinds of conversations that we need to have in breakout sessions when, with our regional compañeros, and really think about where are some of the gaps and how do we try and address those.
Okay.
And, so the model that we use is very unconventional. And it's a model, quite frankly, that probably a lot of folks would be uncomfortable with. But we have, we've stretched ourselves in ways that that many have thought have been unwise, but at the end of the day, like we've won. We win, so that's great. Hopefully we'll keep winning. But we're an all-volunteer organization, so that should also stand as an example too for communities where you don't have the means to hire a staff attorney. There are other avenues that one can take, and talking with people like Kathy and others to see how you kind of try and tap into all of the available resources available, I think is probably a really wise way to go. I hope that's helpful.
My question is for Sarah, but first I had a comment. I wanted to say, God bless you, Edwin, for what you're doing. And Jesus, I wished we lived in New York or California. It's such a different world here.
We have affiliates out there too, and it's not as easy as you think.
No, it's not. So my question for Sarah is two things. First there was California and 187, and then there was Arizona, and now it's us. We have the worst bill in the nation with Senate Bill 4. Your environment was more like Texas than California with 187. Can you just real quickly kind of PowerPoint say, what are things that you did back when you had, the bad bill that's now our Senate Bill 4 to turn the tide? And then also you talked about how you do things that are stretch maybe, I don't know if you can say, but that you win. What, can you touch on both those things?
It's like dirty laundry. So things that I think worked well for us with SB 1070. I think it's really important for me to acknowledge that Southern Arizona has a very different reality than the rest of the state, just as I'm sure South Texas has a very different reality than much of the rest of the state. We have 30,000 Border Patrol agents, always growing, moving through Tucson every day. And that, that obviously was the case long before SB 1070. So the really informal collaboration was always already there. As we started seeing a build up in Border Patrol, that was happening. And I think, I think that part of what happened was it drew attention to what we had always already known. And it actually provided an opportunity for people to stop and listen, including folks in Phoenix and elsewhere in the state, but beyond too. We had been trying to tell that story for a long time, but everyone wanted to think of the border as exceptional, as something that happens down there and it's not going to happen here. And we know that that's not true. And this came up a little bit earlier too in thinking about criminality. And we need to be really careful about playing into these ideas of the abnormal that we're moving away from. It's very, very dangerous, and politically we tend to lose when we do that. Beyond any other ideological kind of grounds there, just strategically it's unwise. So I think that really helped in terms of just kind of drawing attention and some focus. For us in Tucson, we were still under-resourced. We do not, most of the work that happens that had been happening in Tucson for a very long time is all volunteer-driven. So that creates some capacity strains. I know that for our partners in Phoenix, they were able to get a lot of resources, and so that made a really big difference in their fight, and that's really great. We also saw our local ACLU get a lot of additional resources, which was huge. It was really, really, really important. And the success, in various ways, the success that we were able to have came through fights in the courts that were partnered with not stopping at legal strategies and actually looking to political strategies. And so my big takeaway is to always say, okay, there can be a legal strategy, but then what does a political strategy look like? We have to always be looking at both of them. And in this particular moment too, I think, at least from our vantage point in Tucson, and this may or may not be the case if we think about Texas writ large, but we don't have anyone to try and negotiate with or to shame in DC, right? So where we're going to have victories it's going to be uneven, and it's going to be really at the local level. And so, that's my assessment, and I would love to hear what the other panelists might say about that. And so I think, it's just start building those collaborations if they don't already exist, and paying attention to the machinery that actually drags people into the dragnet, and try and find ways to make that untenable.
I actually had a question about this particular issue. So in terms of SB4 here in Texas, in Phoenix, back in 2010, there was a lot of organizations that just kind of came into Phoenix. But maybe it's a perception problem that I have, but is that what's happening here in Texas, or is Texas taking it on alone?
Yes. People are showing up. Actually, probably Maria and probably some of the other people in here can probably answer that question much better. But I would say yes, people are showing up.
Does somebody want to actually address that from the microphone, or?
Maria, you should address that from the microphone. Give Maria Robles a hand as she comes.
Because I have to go back and report.
Well, good afternoon. So actually, yes, we've seen that national organizations are sort of coming to Texas aid. And it's not that we mind it as Texas, because we need all the help we can get, but we've been forming these coalitions since roughly 2007, 2009. So it's not that we don't want to, it's just we need to work in combination from the ground up. So I want to talk to Sarah later on to figure out how did it work there, because we want to make sure that we get the best practices from the organizations that are coming on board and not be from them telling us what to do. Because we think we know pretty much, we've been living with Texas for a while now. But yes,
Yeah.
they have been coming in.
And I'll say this, it's a thing of, there's, and even with Juliana with the North Texas Immigration Education Table and a number of other groups, there are plans that have been created and there are plans that are being created. The assistance that's needed is the same assistance that's probably needed anywhere. Send money so that the plans can be implemented, because the plans exist.
As a matter of fact, this past Saturday, over 32 organizations came together through RITA, Reform Immigration for Texas Alliance, and we voted and we discussed and we figured out, to a degree, how we're going to attack this and how we're going to collaborate with everyone that wants to join the fight in financial boycott, in messaging, and all of that. So that's in the works as well. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so we turn to the oh, please go ahead.
One more,
Yeah, of
Paulineo.
course.
You'd mentioned moving from priorities to protocols. Could you say another word about protocols? We're having a meeting with Customs Border Patrol in this next week, and that's a question I'll have for them.
Yeah, so one of the questions around protocols is if there is no priorities, but there's limited resources, where are you putting those resources? And this is the question you would ask your local ICE agent or your CBP. And in terms of protocols as well, we saw something very interesting happen in LA. One of our young activists was picked up from the Immigrant Youth Coalition. Her name is Claudia, and she was picked up by CBP. And this is beyond the 100 miles from the border. The justification for that was, while there's, the Customs Border Patrol is also at LAX. Her location, her home is 40 miles from the airport. Therefore, it falls under the jurisdiction of the radius of 100 miles. Wow. So that was something new that we had never seen before. And just really like, when we're looking at what are your protocols, it's really like, are you allowing your agents to go rogue or not? How do you hold them accountable? Who's watching who? Because if you don't have that, then what's happening in other states outside of California, because we had a 5% increase in terms of the folks being detained, but everywhere else it jumped significantly beyond that. And a lot of the folks that are getting picked up don't have prior criminal convictions or any interaction with ICE. So the rogue agent idea is something that's very real. So who's watching who's holding who accountable, and then how can we build a community relationship, maybe with the local CBP or ICE, to address that.
Okay, no more than a minute each on
Supposed to solve the world.
what can we aspire to out of the moment? What lasting outcomes can we hope for? Should we start at the far end?
Well, I think I would say that to use these moments to try and, if we're looking at it a broad perspective, to try and change the narrative in the public discourse, right? And I think that that's something that really was so clear in the past panels that, there's a lot of misinformation that's out there that I think, the other side, if you want to put it in terms of other side, use so well to their advantage to kind of spread that misinformation. And I think that we need to use these moments to engage with a broader community of people that might not have been engaged previously, to kind of change hearts and minds, to get the real facts out there, right?
Faith in Texas fundamentally wants to create a new Reconstruction in Texas. That is our goal, that's our mission. We fundamentally need to change some things about the way our state runs, who governs our cities, who governs our state. And I don't mean that in a Democratic, Republican mentality. I mean that in like who, and it should be the people closest to the pain should be driving the train. And so we use these moments then to build base. We use these moments to build up the power of the people, to put the people in front of their legislators. Fundamentally, Texas legislators do not care about big names. They do not care they don't care about how many people you have unless they are from their district and they can vote them in or vote them out. And if we have not built up the power and the capacity to put the people who live in the districts in front of the legislators, we will get nothing done. Absolutely nothing done. So then we use this moment to do that. And Faith in Texas, I'll put this little plug, Faith in Texas is also attempting to expand into the greater Houston area. And so if you are in the audience and you are part of a faith community in the greater Houston area, I would love to talk to you about connecting with your faith community so that we can continue to do this across the state with our partners like TOP, Workers Defense Project, and others who are across the state.
So I would say two things. One is this is a moment to build alliances and friendships and relationships. So I can't tell you how much easier it is to get a cup of coffee with someone now. Well, I don't drink coffee anymore, but it's easier now than it ever was now that I quit. But the other is really Republican engagement. Because look at California. You know, if anything, look at California. What was the result? You know, we went from a high Republican representation, right? Even for your own selfish purpose, you know, as a Republican, when you went against the up-and-coming community, their children remembered, and their children have not forgotten. So is that the legacy you want to leave behind, or do you want to really address this issue and make it work? You know, make it functional, make it something that is not a divisive issue, something that can be resolved. And that's what I would say is, like, folks have relationships with Republicans. You meet with them, you talk with them, sometimes you grab a cup of coffee with them, but really expand on that relationship, really pose that question, challenge that question, put it to them. What does the future hold, you know? Just a thought.
So I think I already said most of what I wanted to say about this, but, you know, so I think, you know, we have to be thinking about political strategies. I think that for folks who come from kind of a legal background, to really think about how you can change some of the types of work that you do so that you can actually incorporate the broader community in it. I think that everyone has a gift to offer, and sometimes our job is helping them figure out how they can do that. I also just want to say, too, that, you know, one of the individuals, there were many, many people who helped to kind of produce some really creative responses that happened in response to SB 1070 in Tucson. One of them now lives in Houston. And so for any of you who are in Houston or near Houston and you've not met Raul Alcaraz Ochoa, you really should, and you should reach out to him. And if you want me to give you his email, he'll kill me that I'm doing this. But there are people who have, we need to understand how much we have to learn from each other in this moment, right? I mean, I think nationwide, that's a feeling that many of us have, but we're not necessarily always enacting that. And so, you know, kudos to the center for bringing us all together in this space so that we can share some of these ideas. And I think we need to really think about how we try and broaden that out and constantly do better with that. So, thanks.
Well, it's a little hard to add to what's already been said, but I think just sort of the narrative that I think we've kind of heard woven through in different ways is essentially that we're stronger together, and that the narrative right now, so often unfortunately coming down from DC, is that somehow we're stronger in our silos and we're stronger apart. So we're stronger together, and I think also the learning has been that none of us is really safe, right? Sort of this thinking, well, they're going after that community, but like I'm over here, so that's okay. But then they're going over to that community, and I think if nothing else since the election, is that we're all sort of in the firing lines, and we need to show up for each other. Immigrant activists need to be showing up for LGBT activists. African Americans need to be showing up for immigrants. White women need to be showing up for our brothers and sisters of color. And so it's not easy work. It's tough work. It's tough conversations. It's a lot of listening. I think sometimes it's important to listen as much as we talk. And so I would really encourage us going into these sessions is to think about in your particular location, who isn't at the table and should be in terms of what you're trying to achieve, and how do you make that happen. And I think it's also important to appreciate that this is work not of weeks or months, it's probably of years. But there are some really hopeful signs, and California, in a lot of ways, is leading the way. But to think, going from Prop 187 to where California is today, and I think sort of knowing our history can help us in this particular fight, that there are some helpful models that can move us forward.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the panel.